Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Learner.
I'm telling the truth, Doc. You gotta believe me.
Then tell me, future boy, who's president of the United States in 1985?
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan? The actor? Then who's vice president? Jerry Lewis?
I suppose Jane Wyman is the First Lady.
Whoa, wait, Doc!
And Jack Benny is Secretary of the Treasury.
Doc, you gotta listen to me.
I got enough practical jokes for one evening. Good night, future boy.
No, wait, Doc!
America was in trouble. Coming out of the Second World War, the US of A emerged from the smoke as a leading world power with the largest, most productive post-war economy of any nation on the surface of this earth.
Kenneth Callum from Arizona.
Okay, boys.
Goddamn war's over.
What do you got to say about
this? This is the happiest day of my life.
It's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
However, that boom wasn't destined to last. Faced with an increasing economic downturn through Jimmy Carter's presidency into the 1980s, America turned to former actor and upcoming Republican politician Ronald Wilson Reagan in hopes that he would be able to do something, anything, to fix an economy that had only a few decades ago hauled itself out of the Great Depression.
I prayed a lot during this period, Reagan wrote, not only for the country and people who were out of work, but for help and guidance in doing the right thing.
I'm David Shoemaker, and this is another episode of Economics USA. Jimmy Carter inherited a faltering economy, but the economy was even worse off when he left office. Energy crises stemming from the invasion of Iran and OPEC crude oil price hikes led to skyrocketing levels of inflation and unemployment, affecting workers and companies in all sectors across the nation. We spoke to former unemployed McDonald's worker turned chili franchise owner, Remy, who remembers what it was like to be a struggling worker under the Carter administration.
Hi, welcome to Chili's. Something needed to change with our country. Stagflation was on the rise, and we needed to stop it. Jimmy Carter's garbage policies ruined honest people like me. The good people of America are being evicted from their homes due to job loss. I was a happy employee at McDinks, and then I lost my job. How am I supposed to support my kids and my beautiful wife in such times of economic turmoil? If I don't buy my wife the new tight and sexy jeans, she will leave me.
Wrote the concept of tight and sexy jeans.
Remy is just one example of the many thousands of workers affected by the downturn of the 70s. But how exactly can we measure the effects of stagflation? At its root, stagflation is an economy under the influences of both high unemployment and inflation. But how can we represent that? And in the long run, how can we fix it? In other words, what is stagflation for an economist? We asked economic analyst and former opera singer Richard T. Gill for help.
The effects of stagflation can be represented graphically in two different ways. To represent stagflation is using the supply and demand curve. Stagflation occurs when there is a supply shift inward, a negative supply shock. This high unemployment inwardly shifts the curve because fewer workers can produce less output. Before this era, the Keynesian policy only dealt with aggregate demand, so the shift could only be made inward and outward on demand, not supply. The demand could be shifted outward to facilitate growth or inward to decrease inflation. However, with this negative supply shock, stagflation was a new issue facing the country. The second graphical representation uses the Phillips curve, named after economist and former crocodile hunter William Phillips. The Phillips curve illustrates the relationship between the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment. As unemployment goes up, inflation decreases. There are more unemployed people, so all jobs, real value, and income has increased. However, stagflation shifts the Phillips curve outward, meaning that no matter what unemployment is, the inflation rate will still be higher than it once was. Now, you can understand why one of Reagan's principal goals was to eradicate stagflation from the American economy, and he was willing to do anything to get there.
In order to combat stagflation, Reagan borrowed extensively from the American public as well as from nations abroad. This worked to close the budget deficit gap. What ended up happening was we saw our federal debt skyrocket from $997 billion to $2.85 trillion by the end of Reagan's presidency.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, America. I would like to have a discussion about the state of our economy. I regret to inform you all that our economy is at its worst since the Great Depression. However, we can and will change. We used to produce 40% of the world's steel. However, due to excessive government regulation and taxation, we now only produce 19%. When there is capital investment, it usually goes towards combating unnecessary government regulation. There is hope to change. We can create incentives for the American worker to take advantage of our economic system.
How exactly did Reagan plan to do this?
I plan to reduce funding for many domestic programs by $39 billion, including an 18.6% cut from the Department of Education and a 24% cut from the Department of Agriculture. I believe that lowering corporate taxes will encourage businesses to expand and hire more workers. We will decrease government regulation and ultimately decrease inflation.
Reagan didn't limit himself to government spending cuts, however. His administration pursued a comprehensive policy of deregulation in sectors ranging from fossil fuels production to cable TV, interstate buses, and the banking system. At the same time, he slashed corporate tax rates as well as the tax percentage on the top income tiers. Overall, the deregulations and tax cuts were indicative of Reagan's return to a formerly constrained free market economy, letting the American people's ingenuity and propensity to make money run free. However, it seems contradictory that cutting taxes would result in stronger economic growth, especially when government revenue plays such a large role in GDP and spending. How can cutting taxes increase the amount of money the government makes? To answer this question, we once again turn to economic analyst Richard T. Gill.
Reagan based his policies on the theory of supply-side economics. Supply-side economics is a macroeconomic theory arguing that economic growth can be most effectively created by lowering taxes and decreasing regulation. It says tax cuts encourage economic expansion enough to broaden the tax base over time. Supply-side economists believe that high marginal tax rates strongly discourage income, output, and the efficiency of resource use. Reagan's policy aims to combat the negative supply shock of stagflation. The increased revenue from a stronger economy is supposed to offset the initial revenue loss from tax cuts. According to the Laffer curve, this only works if the initial tax rates are high enough. High taxes fall in the curve's prohibitive range. Reagan's first tax cuts worked because tax rates were so high that they had passed the threshold of the prohibitive range. However, his second and third tax cuts in 1986 and 1987 were not as effective because tax rates were already reasonable. They had crossed the threshold where tax rate decreases no longer increased tax revenue and encouraged economic growth, as they would if the point had been further on the Laffer curve. He also raised Social Security payroll taxes and some excise taxes, unfortunately undoing some of his efforts forward.
But in order to ensure America would see a prosperous future, Reagan first had to fix the past. In 1971, President Nixon shocked the nation by issuing Executive Order 11615, announcing that he would be ordering, quote, a freeze on all prices and wages for a period of 90 days. Reagan, along with many Americans, saw Nixon's price freeze as a gross abuse of executive power that restricted the economy's ability to freely adjust prices according to fluctuations of supply and demand. Nixon's price controls on oil in particular endured far beyond the intended 90 days and extended into Reagan's presidency. Within his first year in office, Reagan lifted the price controls and succeeded in deregulating the oil industry in other respects as well. Despite possessing different economic philosophies, Nixon and Reagan both essentially shared the same goal, however, to curb rising stagflation. This regimen of slashing taxes and reducing domestic spending did work to combat stagflation. Reagan's economic policies stimulated GDP growth and even sparked an entrepreneurial revolution. However, all this prosperity came at a cost.
In 1982, Reagan signed the Depository Institutions Act, which reversed some of the Great Depression-era regulations and eliminated the cap on interest rates. It seemed like a great idea at the time, but this decrease in regulations encouraged banks to make riskier loans, banks which would later suffer from severe losses. This, coupled with the fact that many institutions were paying more for their deposits than they were earning from their relatively low interest rate mortgages, caused about 1,000 savings and loans associations to fail during the late 80s. Unfortunately, I inherited this dismal economy and was forced to issue $50 billion to failing banks as a bailout.
Interestingly enough, the multi-headed beast that was inflation wasn't directly solved by Reagan. Instead, it was the monetary policies of the Federal Reserve Bank and its chairman, Paul Volcker, who raised interest rates in an effort to offset rising prices that finally knocked inflation out of the park.
Well, you see, this is what the problem was. When Nixon took us off the gold standard in '73, the value of the dollar took a big downturn, raising import prices and bumping up inflation to double digits. When I was appointed by Carter, we already knew we might have to raise the interest rates to unprecedented levels because the previous stop-go policy wasn't really working. The Fed had lost a lot of credibility, and to be honest, the Reagan administration didn't necessarily cooperate fully because it's very hard to decrease inflation and spur growth if the tax cut is too big and there aren't enough proportional spending cuts. Unfortunately, that's just about what ended happening. And even when we doubled interest rates to 20%, the economy still went into a recession. A lot of people ended up getting hurt by that recession, but a big part of it was regaining the trust of the public as a knowledgeable institution, because once people started realizing that we were going to end inflation, they stopped spending, and that sped up the process further because their previous levels of spending were still increasing inflation.
Hi! Reagan's administration came in with an almost stated goal of decreasing inflation and spurring growth. That's very hard to do at the same time. Decreasing inflation entails decreasing spending across the board, from businesses to households. At the same time, asking for pay raises to combat inflation will only make inflation worse. Growth only comes by increasing spending and business activity, the exact opposite of what is needed to decrease inflation. Arguably, the most important part of fighting the inflation was the people's expectation of the inflation. Because once people started spending less to plan for less inflation, the government contracted enough to get back to normal levels. But that contraction resulted in the 1981 recession. I'm smart.
I'm sorry, are you here to see me?
No, silly. I go here.
You go where?
Harvard. What, like it's hard?
In the end, the Volcker shock, as it came to be known, saved the economy from double-digit inflation, even though many jobs were initially lost. Since then, our economy hasn't dealt with inflation at those levels, and indeed, once the storm of 1981 passed, Reagan kept his promise to deregulate the economy and return the nation to a healthy track of GDP growth, although the savings and loans crisis of the 90s came as an unfortunate side effect of banking deregulation. However, he wasn't able to keep all of his promises.
Well, Reagan didn't really decrease government spending as he promised. He spent so much money financing anti-communist efforts in Europe and building up the US military that he actually ended up increasing total government spending. Overall, his spending cuts weren't large enough to offset his massive increase in defense spending. However, I still think it is undeniable that we as a government have to maintain a very strong military, especially when you look at the dangerous influences communism continues to have in many different countries.
Many Americans today have Reagan to thank for their prosperity. We asked Remy how Reagan's presidency and policies helped change his life.
Reagan's economic policies changed my life. I am now the happy, successful owner of a Chili's franchise, and I have succeeded more in life than I ever thought I would. Thank you, Reagan. Now my wife loves me more than she ever did before, and my kids are happy too.
Every president struggles with fiscal policy. Enacting appropriate laws and tactics to spur economic growth will rarely, if ever, have full consensus. Some are lucky to inherit strong economies, others not so. One thing is certain, however. Reaganomics and the men behind it had a resounding success in helping our economy rebound from a long recession and put the U.S. on a growth track for many years to come.
But I am aware of my age. When I go in for a physical now, they no longer ask me how old I am. They just carbon date me.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For this edition of Economics USA, I'm David Shoemaker.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Learner.
For information about this and other Annenberg Learner programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.